Okay. Hello, everyone. It's so lovely to see there are almost 50 people in this orientation session. So welcome to O Week. Some of you may already be students at Flinders and some of you may be brand new. Either way, welcome or welcome back. Unfortunately, this is an online session, but we really are hoping to be able to welcome people back on campus pretty soon. So I'm Janine Harrison. I'm in the College of Education, Psychology and Social Work. I'm a social worker by profession. I have been for about 33 years now. Um, and before I tell you anything more, I would like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Ghana people, that Flinders Social Work operates on these traditional lands and waters, and we pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. We also recognise that the land has never been ceded, that this is and always will be Aboriginal land. And I think it's very important from a social work perspective to recognise that we have a long way to go to address the injustices that have been experienced by Aboriginal people in Australia. So, my role at Flinders, I've got a whole bunch of different things that I do here. One of them is that I'm the academic coordinator for field education. So that's the academic lead in field education. So all of the field placement topics, I kind of oversee them. They have their own topic coordinators as well. And I'm also the topic coordinator for the first placement in the Master of Social Work. You'll also meet the other topic coordinators as you get closer to doing your first placement or whichever placement it is that you are going to be doing. I also coordinate the social work with diverse populations topic in the master's program. I'm actually teaching that for the first time this semester and I'm really excited about it. And I think some of the people in the session will be doing that topic. So I get to meet you before I even meet you in the topic, which is great. So for those of you who haven't worked with Collaborate before, if you keep your microphones muted, just because it helps to keep the sound and the picture quality good, but you're very welcome at any stage to click on the bit that says where you put up your hand and you can either ask a question by turning your microphone on or you can post questions in the chat. I'll try and keep up with the questions in the chat. If I lose track, you might need to just help me to go back and remember all of them because it can move really quickly when we start getting into questions. So I'm going to be with you for a maximum of an hour, but the last part of it is really just for general questions that anybody would like to ask about anything related to field placement. So in the meantime, you're welcome to start posting your questions in the chat that you would like me to address during the course of this session, and we will get back to those. So what I'm going to be doing with you this morning is just giving you a general overview of what we mean when we talk about field placements in social work, some of the basic requirements that you need to know about, and very importantly, some key dates that you need to know about, dates and deadlines. So what is field education? So first of all, it's a core component of Australian social work courses, as it is in most other countries as well. And as you can probably tell, I'm not Australian. I'm actually from South Africa originally, and social work in South Africa is also an accredited degree that has, it actually has a formal registration process in South Africa. You can't be a social worker without being registered. And in Australia, we're about to, in South Australia, for the first time, have compulsory registration of social workers, which I think is a really good move in the right direction. So you will learn through the course of your studies about the Australian Association of Social Workers, which is our accrediting body. And our degrees in social work have to meet the requirements of the AASW in order for us to continue being accredited by them. So our Masters in Social Work is accredited by the Australian Association of Social Work, and our field placement program similarly is also it meets the requirements of the Australian Association of Social Workers. So when we talk about field placement, we're talking about you being in a human services setting in the workplace where you actually get to practice as a student social worker. It's transferring knowledge from the classroom environment to a real practice context. It's learning under the supervision of a qualified social worker, either within the agency where you're placed, or an external social work supervisor who works alongside another supervisor in the agency who may be a different human services professional. So, for example, a psychologist or a well-being coordinator or a youth worker. There's a whole range of different professions. It gives you an opportunity to develop your professional skills and your identity as a social worker, your social values and knowledge and skills. You get exposed to varied practice methods in field placement. And as I said, it's in line with the requirements of the ASW called the ASWES, Australian Social Work Education and Accreditation Standards, which were updated in 2021. Any questions so far? Okay, so what do you need to know about field education? So you have 2 field placements. I hope you already know this because it's a very significant amount of your time over the course of your studies. So it's 1,000 hours in total. That's 500 hours per placement. And if you work it out at 4 days a week, which is what most students do for placement, it takes about 18 weeks for you to do a 500-hour placement. So that's a whole semester, essentially. And the field placement topics normally start just before the semester. In your case, many of you will be doing a placement in the second semester, and you will be starting around mid to late July for your placements. So in the Masters, the first placement is in your second semester of studies. So those of you who have only just started the MSW, your first placement is next semester. So it's very soon after you do your 4 prerequisite topics this semester. Placements are coordinated by the college work integrated learning team. I'll tell you more about them shortly. So that's really important for you to know. I don't organise placements. It's not part of my role. That's done by an administrative team, although of course they do have input from social workers around making sure that the placements meet the ASW requirements and so on. Placements have to meet those requirements. We can't put students in placements that don't meet the requirements. So you can rest assured that when you are put into a placement, that it has been assessed as being in line with the requirements of the ASW. Also, just for those of you who are brand new to Australia, especially, so for international students, it is an advantage if you have a driver's license and access to a car. So if you've got an international driver's license and access to your own car, that's great. Some agencies do require that students drive an agency car, and in order to drive an agency car, you have to have an Australian driver's license. But don't worry, if you don't have an Australian license or don't have a license at all, there are still placement options for you, but it's just a heads up that it's useful for you to have a driver's license if you can, because most agencies do require that students are able to drive. Okay, any other questions at this point? Okay, still with me? Right. Sophie, go ahead.
Just going to ask how placements work for part-time students.
Okay, that's a good question. Do you mind if we hold on to that one until I link it with something that we talk about in a sec?
Yeah, that's fine. No
If I
worries.
forget, if I forget, just give me a heads up. All right. But it's a great question, and certainly there's a possibility of doing part-time placements. Right. So compulsory pre-placement requirements. Urja, the question, is it compulsory to have your own car? No, it isn't. So if you don't have a car, or you don't have a license, or both, don't worry. You can still be placed. It's just that it is an advantage for you to have a car and a driver's license. So Winnie, placement hours, how many days in a week? So most students do 4 days per week. In the masters, it's usually you're on placement Monday to Friday, sorry, Monday to Thursday, and then you have classes on Friday at uni. Whereas the bachelor students do it the other way around. They have their classes on a Monday and then the placement from Tuesday to Friday. So yeah, generally 4 days per week, but I'll come back to Sophie's question shortly. So I'll tell you about the compulsory pre-placement requirements, and then we'll get back to some of those other practical issues about placement. So criminal history checks. You need a national police check for all students, including interstate. So if any of you are joining us from New South Wales or the Northern Territory or Western Australia or anywhere else in Australia, you also are subject to the National Police clearance for your placement, and all placements require those. We also in South Australia require 3 Department for Human Services checks. So that's age, to vulnerable persons, and child related. And that's part of what you do in your preparation for your placement. So you'll be finding out more about that over the next few weeks, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment as well. You also need to do child safe environments training, which trains you how to respond if you're faced with a situation on placement where a child is potentially being abused or is at risk of harm in some way. Because all social workers are mandated reporters, and we have to report situations where children are at risk. You'll find out more about that in your training. There's also a compulsory online hand hygiene training that you have to do, which is COVID safe training, and you'll find out more about that over the course of your um, pre-placement preparation. So Victoria, I know that name. Um, Victoria Z, there might be 2 of you in our program. So you need to get those documents ready a couple of months before you go on placement, but I'll tell you specific deadlines in a moment. Also, most agencies now require COVID vaccinations. If you don't have a COVID vaccination or you have a medical exemption, don't panic. You can talk with us, our work integrated learning team, about that privately, because there may still be options for you. But it's just important for you to have the heads up that most agencies do now require COVID vaccinations. And there are also some agencies that require other vaccinations. So, for example, in aged care, you have to have a flu vaccination. And Debasmita, I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly, you don't necessarily have to have a third dose. It depends on which agency you're in. And if you have these documents due to current employee in the field, it's okay. Yes, it's absolutely okay, Natalie, that you don't have to provide your documents again if you already working in a human services agency and you have all those clearances, as long as you can show us evidence that you've got them. So that's the pre-placement requirements, and I'll tell you shortly about the deadlines that relate to those. So this is probably the most important part of today's presentation. For those of you who are going to be going on placement in second semester, these deadlines are critically important And because there are all kinds of things that students have to do before they can go on placement, you actually can't go on placement without doing these things and meeting these deadlines. We will remind you many times over the course of the next few weeks. So we'll send you emails, we'll post announcements on Flow. So this is not the only time you're going to hear about this, but it's good for you to start, getting clear about these dates. I'll come back to your question in a sec, Jessica. On the 28th of February, which is soon, you're going to be getting an email from the Work Integrated Learning team with instructions to complete a very quick survey. It will just take you a minute, just to let them know that you're planning on doing a placement in the second semester, if that applies to you. So the email is going to be sent on the 28th of February. It will be sent again and again and again after that, several times, but that's the first time it will be sent out. The final deadline to respond to that email is the 14th of March to complete that quick survey. We will, like I say, give you lots of reminders about that. For the students who enroll late in the Masters, we'll also give them an extended deadline, in fairness, because we wouldn't want anyone to miss out because they've enrolled late. So that doesn't apply to any of you because you're here. But trust me, we're going to give you so many reminders about these dates. So just before I tell you about the other dates, going back to Jessica's question, senior first aid is not required, no. There are some agencies that would like first aid training, but they'll actually provide it as part of the placement, not as a pre-placement requirement. And how many hours you have to cover in the placement? It's 500 hours per placement. So 500 hours for your first placement. Most students do 7.5 hours per day. Most students do 4 days per week. It takes 17 to 18 weeks. And you do have 2 placements, yes, and they have to be different. They can't be in the same place. They have to meet the ASW requirements, they have to be in 2 different fields of practice. So, for example, you might do your first placement in, say, aged care, and then you do your final placement, say, for example, in homelessness. If you have intensive classes during the period of placements, don't worry, that does happen. So we let agencies know about the intensive dates that may affect some of their students, but also you can negotiate with the agency that you just take time off for the period of your intensives. Is it possible to do placement during vacation times? Yes, in fact, you have to carry on doing your placement during vacation times. You don't have a break while the university mid-semester breaks are going. You continue to attend placement during that time. Do you need to enroll for placements before you can receive emails? I'm so glad you asked that question, Maggie. No, you don't. Once you've completed the survey, we enroll you in the placement topic, and then once we've enrolled you manually, you then have access to all the information you need related to placement. So no, you don't need to enroll yourself. I'm just going to go to the questions and then I'll go back to the deadlines before I lose sight of your questions. So if you have a DHS child-related clearance, no, sorry, it doesn't cover the vulnerable or aged care. Those are separate clearances. So you would still need to get those. So you have to have all 3 clearances for all placements. Deborah, I'll come back to your question a little bit later on in the presentation. And so if you haven't forgotten about yours. Dong, I'll come back to that in a sec about how you do those clearances. So the deadline, so that the first deadline, like I said, is that very quick survey that just lets us know that you intend to do your placement. The second deadline is the 21st of April, which is when you have to enter your personal information on a platform called InPlace, which is our placement management platform that we use. You'll get very detailed instructions about this, so don't worry if it doesn't make sense yet. But in place is where you provide information about yourself, your background. You also include information about your areas of interest. But for first placement, it's not usually possible to match students to placement in their areas of interest. So it's important that you would be able to be flexible and open to any learning experience in a field placement. So let me just go to Trisha's question first of all before I'll put my microphone off and see if that helps. You want to try again, Trish?
My question is, oh, sorry.
Do you want to ask a question in the chat if you're having feedback on your microphone? Okay. And Yanis, yes, this is being recorded so that you can have access later, and the slides will be available also through the Finding Your Way Flinders flow site. Sorry, I'm going all over the place. So just going back to the information that you provide about yourself on In Place, again, we will give you detailed instructions about that. You'll be shown exactly where to go, what to do, what questions to answer. It's really important that you answer all the questions on In Place, because those the information you provide is used to match you to a placement, even if you're interstate. And so it's really important that you meet that deadline, and we will give you several reminders along the way as well. So I'm giving you these dates so that you can diarise them, but we will give you lots and lots and lots of reminders to make sure that everybody does what they need to do before they go on placement. And then the final deadline is the 1st of June is the deadline for uploading all of your compulsory compliance documents on In Place. So that's your clearances, your hand hygiene certificate, your child safe environment certificate. You will be given detailed instructions about how to do that. So the DHS clearances in Adelaide, for example, our work integrated learning team actually helps you with that. They will tell you exactly what you need to do, and they start the process for you. So you'll be guided through that process quite carefully. So don't worry, it doesn't have to make sense now. You will be guided quite specifically through all these processes. But it's really important for you to be aware of the deadlines and to pay attention to the emails that we will send to you to remind you of the deadlines. Sorry, just bear with me for a sec. I'm just going back to the questions that I can't see anymore. Victoria, your question about in an area of interest for the first placement. So final placement, you're more likely to be placed in an area of interest. And the main reason for that is that there are a lot of agencies that will only accept final placement students. So for example, SA Health, the Department for Child Protection, the Department for Correctional Services generally only accept final placement students. So when you're doing your first placement, the options that the Work Integrated Learning team has to work with are much more limited. So for your first placement, it's really important that you're open to going anywhere. And then for your final placement, like I say, it's more likely that you're going to get a placement in one of your areas of interest. But again, it's important that you have some flexibility, because if you I've seen over the years students who say, I don't want to work in mental health, I don't want to do child protection, I don't want to do domestic violence, I don't want to do homelessness, and the list of places they don't want to go is so long that it pretty much excludes almost everything. Those students are going to struggle, because if you have that level of rigidity, in your outlook about learning opportunities, you're probably going to find almost any placement experience challenging. So again, that having that openness and flexibility is in your interests to help you to have a better, happier placement experience. Jessica, I'm not sure about your question. Is that for third and fourth years at this stage? So you're possibly talking about the bachelor's program. So in the bachelor's program, students do their first placement in the third year of the bachelor's. Am I right? Third year? Yes, third year of the bachelor's program. And you do your final placement in the fourth year of the bachelor's program. I don't know if that answers your question. And then Trish, being an interstate student. Yeah, so it's a bit more tricky for those of you who are interstate. So for those of you in Adelaide, don't listen to this because you're going to get confused. But if you're interstate, so in Melbourne or Sydney or Darwin or Perth or a remote area, it's a combination of sometimes we have placements that we can match you to depending on where you live, but if we don't, there's someone in the work integrated learning team who will help you to identify placements, but essentially you would have to do some of the work to find your own placement, but you do get support from someone in the work integrated learning team. So that's for interstate students. The Adelaide students, just ignore what I said. Jessica, let's see. If you work with children in your first placement, does that mean you can't work with them in your second? No, it doesn't, because working with children is so broad that you could, for example, work in child protection in one of your placement experiences, and you could work in a school in your other placement, and those are so different that it would still be okay for you to have both of those experiences working with children. Sophie, did you have another question, or shall I come back to your question now about part-time students?
Yeah, that was my question.
Okay. So for those of you who are part-time, yes. So some of you have work responsibilities and you have to juggle placement alongside your work. The minimum number of days per week that you can do on placement is 3, unless you have a university access plan for a medical condition or disability. The minimum number of days in terms of the ASW requirements is 2, so a minimum of 15 hours per week. If you do have a disability or medical condition, I recommend that you apply for an access plan. You can do that through the Health Counselling and Disability Service. And then you provide us your access plan. You don't have to disclose what your condition is, but your access plan tells us what you need on placement to make your placement manageable for you. And then we make sure that those conditions are met for your placement. And then for those of you who are doing it part-time, so in response to Sophie's question, you can apply to do placement 3 days a week instead of 4. So again, in the pre-placement process, you would let us know about that, and then we would make sure that you get matched to a placement that allows you to do 3 days per week, because most of them require 4 days per week. But don't worry, if you can't do 4 days per week, there are always options. It just means that they're a little bit more limited, but they're still possible. There was another question that someone put their hand down again. So you're welcome to ask it again if you would like to. I'll keep going in the meantime. Sophie, did you want to ask another question?
Yeah, I was just wondering how it actually works with, like, you know how like it happens in the third year, and I know that like part-time you go a little bit slower than full-time. Do you still do your placement in your third year, or is it technically your fourth year because it's like a 5-year degree?
You can extend your studies and do them over a longer period. So a lot of students do that. So for example, you might load up with some of your academic topics beforehand and get those done. and then come back and do your placement just with one other topic in one semester, so that you've got more time available to focus on your placement. So you certainly do have that option, except international students, because of their visa requirements, have to do it full time, which personally I think is unfortunate, because it's puts a lot of pressure on you as an international student, which I don't think is always good for people's well-being, and for having the best learning experience. Philippe, how's the placement assessed? I could go into a lot of detail about that, but essentially, there's a university field education liaison person who works with each student on placement, and you get a set of learning outcomes that you have to demonstrate evidence for across the course of your placement, and your supervisor, social work supervisor, and yourself provide feedback and evidence over the course of your placement, and your field education liaison person is responsible for assessing your performance. If there are any questions or concerns, then they do so in consultation with the topic coordinator for the placement. The learning outcomes for placement are based on the ASW practice standards, and there are 8 practice standards. So it's things like your communication and interpersonal skills, your ability to apply social theory to your practice, your ability to understand the context that you're working within, your ability to record information appropriately, your ability to follow ethical practice requirements, your professionalism, and yes, the learning outcomes are the same for everyone. That's correct. Nicola, go ahead. Nicola,
Hi, I just
hear you. There we go.
oh great, sorry. So I'm similar to Sophie. I'm studying part-time and I'm based in Melbourne. So I was sort of planning on stretching it over 4 years. So I imagine
Yep.
I would do my first placement at the end of next year, and then the following at the end of the 4th year. Is that
Okay.
right? Do you think that, I mean, it's sort of quite flexible, or is
Yes, absolutely. So you keep fading out, Nicola, but I think I heard your question. It is flexible if you're studying part-time. Unless you're an international student, unfortunately, because your visa requirements mean you have to do it full-time. But yes, certainly you can do it part-time. You can stretch it over 4 or even 5 years, depending on your particular commitments. Mayra, I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly. Is it possible to change agencies during the course of the placement? Only under certain circumstances. So if you have a placement termination for a legitimate reason and we have a policy framework around that, then it is possible to change agencies over the course of your placement. So what I'd recommend is probably not to get too caught up on that sort of detail yet, because you'll get much more information about those sorts of things closer to the time. So for now, probably the most important thing is what you need to do to prepare for placement and what placement is. So just going back, I'm just answering questions before I go to the next bit. If you work with children, I've answered that already. Okay, great question, Natalie. So yes, there are 2 things. Recognition of prior learning, or RPL. For those of you who have extensive experience in human services, so a minimum of 3 years equivalent full-time human services experience that's similar to what a social worker would do, you may be eligible for recognition of prior learning, and there's a process for applying for that. You can look it up on the university website. That's the one thing. So if if you're successful in your application for RPL, it means you get credit for your first placement, and you only have to do 1 placement. Your other question is to do a work-based placement. So if you currently work in a human services setting in a role that is similar enough to what a social worker might do, or a role that could be adapted to meet the learning outcomes, then it's possible to do a work-based placement. And again, we have a process that you follow to apply for that, because we have to make sure that it meets the ASW requirements. But absolutely, it's possible to do a work-based placement, and there are quite a few students who do that every semester. There are also quite a few students who get RPL every semester, and then only have to do one placement to be able to meet the ASW requirements. Nate, I actually don't know the details about housing support if you want to do a rural placement, but there is some housing support. You will find out more about that in a later information session that's going to be provided by the Work Integrated Learning team, because we actually do try to encourage students to do rural or remote placements. There's a shortage of social workers in a lot of those areas, so you will find out more about that. Philippe, yes, contact me about that question. I will be the best person to contact. So my email address, I think, is at the end of the slides, but otherwise you can find it on the web. Placements are every semester, yes, Adelia. So you can do them in first or second semester, depending on your study plan. Are all placement classes and assignments online during the course? No. Placement classes, if you're enrolled in the on-campus version of the topic, you do your placement seminars on campus, apart from pandemic policies, depending on what's happening at the time. But if you're enrolled in the online version, then you do them online. Is there still an option to go to Alice Springs for the final placement? Yes, absolutely. So there are certainly students who do their placement in Alice Springs, all over Australia. We have placements all over Australia. Right, so I'm going to keep going with the other bits that I want to tell you about, which also includes some of the questions that people have already been asking. And then I'm going to leave some space for you to ask any other questions you might have. So don't forget about those deadlines and dates, but like I say, we're going to remind you about them over and over and over and over again until you're sick and tired of hearing from us. Time frames and placement attendance. The time frame for semester 2, I think I did say to you already, you would start your placements from mid to late July, depending on where you're going. It varies depending on the placement, on training requirements. But you do need to be available before and after the semester, and you need to be available in May and June to attend a placement interview, because all agencies that take students on placement do a pre-placement interview before they confirm that they're willing to accept a student on placement. I've already told you about all of those, but just a heads up, for those of you who do have an access plan and need to do your placements over 2 or 3 days a week instead of 4. If you do it 2 days a week, it takes 9 months, so it's like a pregnancy. If you do it 3 days a week, it takes 6 months, and that's all okay. We can accommodate that, but just to be aware that it goes way over the length of a semester. So, just to bear that in mind in terms of organising your life and, childcare and all that sort of stuff that might be relevant to you. I'm going to talk about some common questions, but before I do that, I'll just quickly see if there's anything else. Jessica, if you're in the bachelor's program, you only do your first placement in the 3rd year of the program. In the master's program, you do your first placement in your 2nd semester, which is your 1st year of the master's. In the bachelor's program, you do your final placement in your 4th year. And in the master's program, you do your final placement in your 2nd year, in your final semester, if that makes sense. Can you get a notice from the college before starting any activity like classes? Krishna, I'm not sure what you mean. The details of your classes are on your timetable. Most topic coordinators do also communicate with students by email, and we also put announcements on Flow, letting you know about your classes. But generally, the information you need would be in your timetable. I don't know if that answers your question. Um, I'm going to talk about these common questions for a moment before I go back to yours. So, can I organise my own placement? If you're interstate or in a remote area of South Australia, yes, you can organise your own placement, and we have someone in the college office who can support you with that. If you're in Adelaide, no, you can't organise your own placement. We have really strict policies around that for lots of reasons, including that agencies don't want to be contacted by hundreds of students trying to organise placements with them. So if you're based in Adelaide, anywhere in Adelaide, from Murray Bridge to Victor Harbour to Gawler and all the suburbs around Adelaide, the college actually organises the placement for you, and you shouldn't be contacting agencies yourself. And we have hundreds of students, and UniSA also has a social work program. They have hundreds of students, so agencies just can't manage being contacted by dozens of people who wanting to do a placement with them. The placements are done through the university. What days do I go on placement? I think I've already spoken about that. Can you go overseas? At the moment, we don't have an overseas placement program. But for example, if you were stuck in, say, I don't know, Singapore because of COVID, and you might have an option of doing a placement there, as long as it meets the ASW requirements and it meets our requirements, it might be possible. So you can talk with us about that individually. Natalie, the information about applying for RPL, I don't know offhand whereabouts on the website that is. If you do a search for recognition of prior learning, if you can't find it, just send me an email. I'm just going to put my email address in the comments. Just send me an email and I will send you the link to be able to apply. So just stay with me for a sec while I put my email address in here. Okay. Can I have previous work in human services counted? Like I said, if you're eligible for recognition of prior learning, have a look at the eligibility requirements and you may be able to apply for that. Really spoken about can I do my placement in my current workplace? If your role is similar enough to what a social worker would do, or it's possible to adapt your role to make it meet the ASW requirements, then that is possible. And like I say, there's someone in the college who can help you with that. So the last little bit of time we have is for you to ask any other questions you would like to ask about field placements. Oh, thanks, Naomi. Awesome. The link for recognition of prior learning. Anything else anyone would like to ask? And there's no such thing as a stupid question. Can you organise your own placement if you're interstate, so not in Adelaide? Yes, you can. But if you're in Adelaide, and that includes the outer suburbs of Adelaide, like Murray Bridge, Victor Harbour, Gawler, then no, you can't organise your own placement. But we'll give you much more detailed information about placements closer to the time. There's an information session that we do with students on Flow, and then there's also a website that you will all have access to, which gives much more detail about placements. Jessica, go ahead.
If we're looking to get a placement that's reasonably local to where we live, is that considered?
You mean in Adelaide?
Yes, yeah.
So the work integrated learning team who do the placements, they do look at geographic location of students and placements, but it's important to be aware that Adelaide is a very spread out city. Students don't necessarily live in kind of neat alignment with where agencies are located. So depending on where you live, you might have to travel a fair distance to get to placement. So for example, if you live in the north, it's less likely that you're going to have to travel far because there are not many students who live in the north, but there are a lot of placements up there. Whereas if you live in the inner south, there's so many students who live in the inner south that they tend to have to be spread out to the west, the south, the east, the kind of all over the place in order to accommodate all of those students, if that makes sense.
If we have a particular area of interest, is it at all possible that it would be considered like as somewhere to send us if it's a first placement?
It's possible. So when you do your information on InPlace about yourself, you can actually, there's a question about interests, so you can actually note there if there's a particular interest that you would like the team to consider, and sometimes it is possible. So if you meet that agency's requirements, because that's the other thing, you have to be able to meet the agency's requirements, then it might be possible for you to be matched to a placement there.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, okay. So Trish, just going back to your question, your Bachelor of Social Work full-time, yeah, that happened in the third year, that's correct. And for first placement in the Bachelor's, they happen in first semester of the third year. When should interstate students start organising placements, Trish? We will guide you with that process when we do the information session. So you should start looking into that in April, but we will have an information session specifically about that to give you more details to help you. Does the placement depend on your grades and your assignments? No. One of the principles we have in the placement matching process is that it has to be equitable. Certain students shouldn't be disadvantaged over other students. One of the issues we have is that international students, by their nature, are disadvantaged because they haven't lived in Adelaide. They don't have the network that local students do. And so we try to make it a fair process where everybody has fair access to placement opportunities, and your grades make no difference whatsoever in the placement coordination process. Cindy, the question in the RPL, I would suggest that you email that question to me because that looks like a little bit more of a complicated one. So just email that to me and I'll try and answer it better. Do you get a form to fill out your vaccination history? Yes, you not a form, but you would upload your vaccination certificate on InPlace close to the time, and you'll be told how to do that and where to find InPlace and all of that stuff. What is the rate of employability for students after they complete their final placement? You mean from your final placement? I'm glad you asked that question, Shay. There's a bit of a myth that students get employment out of their final placement in large proportions. Some students do get employed from their final placement, but it's a small proportion. However, social work students from Flinders have one of the highest rates of employability in Australia. So generally, after completion of your studies, whether you're in the bachelor's or the master's, your chances of finding a job are excellent if you have graduated from Flinders. And there's such a shortage of social workers in some settings that it doesn't really matter where you've had a placement. What matters is how you present yourself at an interview. But we'll talk more with you about that sort of stuff later on in the course of your studies. Jessica, so the rural placement opportunities you'll get, there's an information session that will be done by the Work Integrated Learning team in about March or April, early April, and that'll give you much more information about the rural placements and also about interstate placements. Do you supply ourselves? So Trish, once you've indicated through that survey that you want to do a placement in second semester, that'll start a process where you'll be added to a flow site, you'll be manually enrolled in a field placement topic, and they will start the process of you're applying for the criminal history checks, and you'll be guided through that process as well. So it's actually, once you've indicated that you want to do a placement, then it's actually quite an easy process. There's a lot of work to do, but it's quite easy. So you will get more information about that. Jessica, did you have another question?
No, sorry, I just left that on.
That's all right, no worries. Any other questions? Okay. So just before we finish off, if you have queries about placements, in the first instance, contact the College Work Integrated Learning team. The email address is swplacements@flinders.edu.au. So that's specifically for social work placements, and that's their telephone number. There are currently 2 administrators who answer queries for social work placements. They're lovely. Just to let you know, they are very busy. They get about 200 emails a day. I also get about 200 emails a day. So if you send me an email and I don't reply the same day, it's just because you're in the middle of a couple of hundred, but I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And any queries you have about field placements, you're welcome to let them know. But don't bombard them yet with queries, because the first thing you'll get is that email about the survey that you need to complete about your placement. And then there's that information session. You'll have access to a flow site, which gives you a whole lot of information about placement. So we'll take you through these bits and pieces of information through the course of you preparing for your placement. Kai or Key, placement, you do have interviews before your placement, so, and it is like a job interview. It's actually a really good idea to treat it like a job interview, because it is up to the agency to decide whether or not they're going to accept you on placement. We also do provide guidelines for preparing for a placement interview, what kinds of questions you can expect, how you should or shouldn't present at an interview, guidelines for things that you need to think about before you go for your interview, and so on. So we will also give you more information about that stuff close to the time. Anything else that anyone would like to ask before we wrap up? We've got a couple more minutes. So I guess the most important messages I want to leave you with are 2. One is there are really important dates and deadlines. Please make sure that when you get emails from the Work Integrated Learning team, you follow those instructions and meet the deadlines, because you won't be able to go on placement if you don't. The second thing is, don't stress too much. There is a lot of information that's related to preparing for a placement, but we will take you through that process step by step. Try not to worry about everything that you need to do right now, because you don't have to do all of it straight away, and we will give you more information along the way. And probably most importantly, most people have a really good experience on field placement. They learn a lot. They sometimes have fun. They meet interesting people. And it's a really, really good opportunity to learn in a real human services setting about the nature of social work and the nature of human services. Trishna, you're an international student, but now in Adelaide. If you have a question about anything, then where do you contact? So if it's a question about placement, you contact the Work Integrated Learning team. If it's a question about one of your topics, you contact the topic coordinator for that topic. If it's a question about anything that's not related to social work, then it depends. You could send an email to the college inquiries email address. And if you're not sure who to ask, send me an email. and I'll head you in the right direction, but just be aware it might take a few days before I can respond because, like I say, I get about 200 emails a day. And I do like to be very responsive to students, but sometimes I'm absolutely drowning in emails. So just before we wrap up, I'd like to say good luck with your MSW studies. I think there might actually be some bachelor students in this presentation as well. So good luck with your bachelor's studies as well. I really hope that you not only enjoy the process of learning, but also find that the course of studying social work gives you opportunities to think about yourselves in a really helpful way, look at your self-care, your well-being, learn more about yourselves. We have lovely staff in general in social work. I think you'll find staff are very supportive and lovely in general. And I really wish you well over the course of your studies, and good luck with your placements as well. And where can you access the recording? It will be on the Finding Your Way at Flinders site, I believe. I'm not exactly sure where, but the people who organised the orientation said that it's going to be available on the Flow site. So thank you so much for all of you who have participated and attended. It's been lovely to see lots of faces, and I look forward to meeting you in person, hopefully over the next few weeks or months, depending on when we cross paths. And I wish you all the very best, not only with your studies, but also in this very strange world we live in at the moment with the pandemic and COVID and all of that stuff. Take care of yourselves and each other, and we will see you soon.